In a city built on rituals and rivalries, where every handshake is analyzed and every silence politicized, they were the two most watched, most judged, and most isolated women in the world, separated by an ocean, a generation. And the chasm of American politics, their paths were never meant to cross meaningfully. One, a former barrister and duchess who learned to curtsy in the global spotlight. The other, a former model and first lady who navigated a presidency like no other. They lived in parallel universes of intense scrutiny, each a symbol for supporters and a target for critics. Yet, on a crisp spring day in London, protocol would force them into the same frame, into the same conversation, into a moment of unexpected human connection that would, for a fleeting afternoon, quiet the noise of nations and remind the world that even the most gilded of cages have two people inside, simply trying to get through the day. This is the untold story of that afternoon. Not of diplomacy, but of discretion, not of politics, but of a private understanding that flashed between two public figures when the world was watching but didn't truly see. The motorcade was a silent, sleek beast gliding through the cordoned streets of London, a river of black in a sea of historic stone. Inside one of the cars, Melania Trump adjusted the cuff of her pristine white dress, her gaze fixed on the passing blur of Regent's Park. The city unfolded outside her window, a pageant of tradition that felt both foreign and familiar. She was here as part of the state visit, a pinnacle of diplomatic theater, where every minute was choreographed, every smile measured. Her role, as always, was to be impeccably composed, a serene counterpoint, a visual ambassador. She thought of the schedule, a dense document of timings and titles. A luncheon at Buckingham Palace, then the ceremonial welcome, the exchange of gifts, the banquet. And within that, an entry that simply read, "Private meeting with HRH the Duchess of Cambridge." It was a line item, one of many. She had met royalty before. It was a part of the life she had chosen. But this meeting felt different, tinged with a quiet anticipation she couldn't entirely name. The media, of course, was already in a frenzy. The Summit of Styles, one headline blared. East Wing versus Apartment 1A, quipped another. They reduced it to a fashion face-off, a political odd couple. Melania understood the game. She had learned to build a wall of impeccable silence, a fortress of self-possession that very few could penetrate. Yet, the thought of meeting Catherine, the Duchess who seemed to navigate her own gilded fishbowl with a similar, steely grace, piqued something beyond professional duty. Across the city, in the private sitting room of Kensington Palace, Catherine was experiencing a different kind of pressure. The rain earlier had threatened the outdoor plans, but now a frail English sun was struggling through the clouds. Her team had briefed her extensively. This was more than a standard royal greeting. It was a moment of intense global scrutiny. The Trumps were, without question, the most controversial visitors of the decade. Protests were planned. The political divisions of America had leaked across the Atlantic. Her job was to be the neutral, charming, and utterly diplomatic face of the monarchy, to smooth over any awkwardness, to embody tradition and continuity. She practiced her smile in the mirror, not the wide, camera-ready one, but the smaller, more genuine one she used in quieter moments. She thought of Melania, of the relentless, often cruel, scrutiny the woman endured. Catherine knew something about that. The endless commentary on her clothes, her parenting, her every expression. But hers was a scrutiny born of a chosen path into an ancient institution. Melania's seemed forged in the volatile crucible of modern politics and media. As she fastened her earrings, a gift from her grandmother, she felt a flicker of empathy, a professional curiosity mixed with a very human wondering. What was it like in that other, louder world? The grandeur of the Buckingham Palace reception room was designed to overwhelm, and it succeeded. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, their light glinting off gold leaf trim and centuries-old portraits. The air smelled of polished wood, old books, and the faint, sweet scent of the massive floral arrangements that punctuated the room. It was here, amidst the echoing murmurs of dignitaries and the soft click of official photographers, that they were introduced. Melania entered first, a study in minimalist elegance, her posture perfect, her expression composed into a pleasant, inscrutable mask. Catherine approached, her stride confident, her cornflower blue dress a classic, welcoming choice. Their handshake was captured by 100 lenses, firm, brief, accompanied by the standard pleasantries. "Such a pleasure to welcome you to London," Catherine said, her voice warm with the practiced cadence of royalty. "Thank you. It's a beautiful city," Melania replied, her accent softening her words. The moment was public, polished, empty. It gave the cameras exactly what they wanted, a historic frame. But as their eyes met and held for a fraction longer than strictly necessary, something unscripted passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the shared circus that surrounded them. It was not friendship, not yet even understanding, but a spark of mutual recognition. The luncheon was a lesson in delicate navigation. Seated beside each other at the vast, ornate table, they were islands of relative calm in a sea of diplomatic chatter. Conversations swirled around them: trade, security, old alliances. Melania listened, her responses measured and few. Catherine, to her right, expertly guided conversations, asking after Baron, complimenting the success of the state visits events so far. They spoke of safe, universal topics, the challenges of raising children in the public eye, the importance of family routines. Melania mentioned Baron's height, a rare, unprompted offering of personal detail that made Catherine laugh, a genuine, unguarded sound. "I know the feeling. George is all knees and elbows these days," she confided. It was a small bridge, built on the common ground of motherhood. They discussed their respective causes: Melania's best campaign, Catherine's early childhood work. The conversation was careful, avoiding the third presence in the room, the men at the other end of the table, whose dynamic dominated the political narrative. Here, in their own bubble, they were not the wife of him and the wife of the future king. They were two women who had to give speeches, who had to champion platforms, who understood the weight of using their position for something beyond ceremony. Melania, often portrayed as disinterested, spoke with a quiet intensity about online safety for children. Catherine listened, nodding, seeing past the media caricature to the person who had clearly done her homework. The formality of the setting began to recede, just a little, around their corner of the table. Later, during a brief interval before the next engagement, they found themselves momentarily alone in a smaller antechamber, waiting to be summoned. The noise from the main hall was a distant hum. A palisade had brought them each a fresh glass of water. The silence was not uncomfortable, but heavy with the things they could not say. Melania looked out the window at the palace gardens. "It is very quiet here," she observed, not turning around. "In the middle of the city, but so quiet." Catherine came to stand beside her. "It can be. Sometimes that's the greatest luxury, isn't it? A moment of quiet." She glanced at Melania. "The noise, it can be constant." It was not a question. Melania met her gaze, and for the first time, her guard seemed to lower a millimeter. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Constant," she echoed softly. It was a single word, but in it, Catherine heard volumes. The screaming headlines, the social media storms, the endless analysis, the impossible expectations. An aide appeared at the door, breaking the spell. "Your Royal Highness, Madam First Lady, they are ready for you." They turned from the window, their public masks settling back into place. But as they walked side by side back into the roar of the official visit, the memory of that quiet moment, that single word of understanding, hung in the air between them. The first layer of the performance had been peeled back, just a little, revealing not adversaries or rivals, but two individuals sailing similar, yet profoundly different, untouchable ships. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the picture gallery, casting long shadows across the portraits of kings and queens who had seen their own share of diplomatic trials. The next phase of the visit was a curated tour of the royal collection, a moment intended to showcase culture and shared history, away from the blunt instruments of politics. Melania and Catherine walked together, a few paces behind the main group of President Trump, Prince Charles, and their aides. The pace was leisurely, allowing the two women a semblance of private conversation amidst the very public setting. They paused before a painting of Queen Charlotte, a woman who had also been a foreigner in this palace, who had to learn its rules and rhythms. She was very young when she came here, Catherine remarked, her voice low. 18. She didn't speak much English. One can only imagine how overwhelming it must have been. Melania studied the painted face, the composed expression that likely hid a multitude of anxieties. It is a skill, she said after a moment, to learn a new language, not just the words. Catherine nodded, understanding perfectly. The language of court, the language of the media, the language of expectation. It becomes second nature after a while, but is always a performance to some degree. This frankness, this slight pulling back of the royal curtain, was offered carefully. In return, Melania shared a sliver of her own experience. In my previous life, the performance was different. It was about a look, a walk, a moment. Now, she gestured slightly, a minimal movement of her hand. The performance is 24 hours. There is no runway exit. It was the most she had spoken about her past and present in one breath. Catherine listened, not as a duchess to a first lady, but as one performer to another. The runway is perhaps simpler, Catherine agreed. At least the critique ends when the lights go down. They moved on, the soft tap of their heels on the polished floor a private rhythm. The conversation drifted, as if carried by the portraits they passed. They spoke of the peculiarities of always being on, of the way a simple grocery list, if glimpsed, could become a news story. Catherine mentioned the strange reality of knowing that a casual outfit for a school run would be photographed and analyzed for its meaning and price tag. Melania offered a dry, almost wry observation about the commentary on her choices of footwear, whether for a hurricane-ravaged area or a state dinner. One cannot win, she said, and for the first time, Catherine heard a thread of weary humor in her voice, not bitterness. They were comparing notes from the front lines of a war they had never enlisted in, finding a strange, comforting alignment in their shared, surreal realities. The tour led them to a quieter corridor, lined with less imposing landscapes. Here, the official photographers were kept at a greater distance. The sound of the men's voices ahead was a distant rumble. In this relative pocket of calm, Catherine made a decision. She gestured to a small, upholstered bench nestled in an alcove. Shall we? They seemed deeply engrossed in whatever it is they're discussing. It was a small act of minor rebellion against the schedule. They sat, the rich fabric of their dresses rustling softly. For a few minutes, they were observers, not the observed. They watched the main party pause before a massive tapestry, the president gesticulating, Prince Charles listening with a polite, fixed expression. I think, Melania said quietly, her eyes on the scene, your father-in-law has the harder job today. It was a politically neutral but deeply insightful comment. Catherine smiled, a real, tired smile. He does have the patience of a saint. It's part of the job description, I'm afraid. Then, she ventured a little further. And your husband, he certainly seems to enjoy the pageantry. It was as close as either would come to acknowledging the elephant in every room. Melania's response was considered. He enjoys results. Pageantry is a tool, a very shiny tool. The choice of words was deliberate, distancing herself just enough from the spectacle while acknowledging its utility. Catherine understood the nuance. She had seen many leaders use the monarchy as a backdrop for their own narratives. It is a tool we are very used to providing, she replied diplomatically. Then she added, it must be tiring constantly having to define the narrative, rather than just inhabit it. It was a profound observation, highlighting the difference between an inherited, centuries-old role and a brutally modern, politically constructed one. Melania simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. The silence that followed was companionable, a shared respite in the eye of the hurricane. Their moment was interrupted not by an aide, but by a more unexpected force. A distant, familiar chime echoed down the corridor, the specific tone of an iPhone. Both women instinctively tensed, a Pavlovian response to the sound of the outside world intruding. A young equerry hurried up, looking apologetic. "Your Royal Highness, my apologies, it's the office. They need a quick word about the timing for the children's presentation later." Catherine excused herself, stepping a few feet away. As she spoke in hushed, efficient tones, Melania was left alone on the bench. She didn't fidget. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze drifting back to the landscape paintings. But her posture, usually so rigidly perfect, softened just a fraction. She looked for a fleeting moment, like anyone waiting for a friend to return from a phone call, slightly detached, peacefully suspended in time. Catherine returned, her expression a blend of apology and exasperation. "The tyranny of the timetable," she said, sitting back down. "I am sorry." Melania waved a dismissive hand. "I understand." She paused. "The children will be part of the greeting?" "Yes," Catherine said, her face lighting up with a warmth that was entirely unprofessional and wholly maternal. "George, Charlotte, and Louis. They've been practicing their curtsies and handshakes for days." She spoke of Louis's tendency to wave with both hands, of Charlotte's solemn determination to get it right, of George trying to act older than his years. As she spoke, Melania's expression changed. The inscrutable mask melted away, replaced by a look of genuine, unguarded warmth. "Baron was the same," she said, her voice softer. "At that age, he wanted to do everything correctly. Now he is taller than me, and the handshake is very firm." She shared a small anecdote about Baron teaching his father a new video game, a rare glimpse into the private, normal life she fiercely protected. In the exchange of these simple stories of stubborn toddlers and growing teenagers, the last vestiges of formality dissolved. They were quite simply two mothers sharing a quiet pride and the universal, funny anxieties of parenting, regardless of the palaces or penthouses they called home. An aide did eventually approach, indicating it was time to rejoin the main group for the next event. As they stood, Catherine gently touched Melania's arm, a brief, spontaneous gesture. "It was lovely to talk," she said, and she meant it. Melania placed her own hand over Catherine's for a second. "Yes, thank you." The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was a physical affirmation of the connection that had been woven in the last hour, through shared confessions about performance, through silent observation, through the common language of motherhood. They walked back into the heart of the visit, the sound of their footsteps once again in sync, but the space between them was different now. It was no longer a diplomatic gap to be bridged, but a shared space, quietly understood. They rejoined the leaders, falling seamlessly back into their roles, the gracious Duchess, the poised First Lady. But now, when their eyes met across the group, it was with a new layer of knowing. They had built a small, silent fortress of mutual understanding, brick by careful brick, in a hallway lined with the ghosts of history. The world saw two elegant women following a protocol. They now carried the memory of a conversation that had, however, briefly, transcended it. The climax of the day's public engagements was the ceremonial welcome on the Buckingham Palace balcony. It was the ultimate photo opportunity, a tableau of power and pageantry against the backdrop of London's skyline. The air buzzed with the hum of a massive crowd gathered beyond the gates, and the whirring clicks of long-lens cameras from the media pen below. For Melania, such moments were a familiar part of the landscape, but this one felt different. The British ritual was older, denser with meaning, a script written over centuries. As she stepped out into the crisp afternoon light beside the president, the roar of the crowd, a mix of cheers and the distant, muffled chants of protesters, washed over her. She maintained her serene expression, a slight, polite smile fixed in place. Catherine emerged with the rest of the royal family, a vision in dove gray. The two women took their assigned positions, not side by side, but within each other's line of sight. The Royal Air Force flypast was moments away, a thunderous punctuation marked to the ceremony. As the first roars of the aircraft engines built in the distance, Catherine leaned over to say something to Princess Charlotte, adjusting her daughter's dress and pointing skyward. The gesture was instinctive, maternal, and utterly human. Melania watched from a few feet away. She saw not a future queen guiding a princess, but a mother calming her child before a loud noise. In that split second, the entire elaborate edifice of crowns and titles fell away. It was a mirror of her own life, the constant duality of public duty and private need. She remembered holding Baron's hand during loud parades, the squeeze of reassurance. The aircraft screamed overhead in perfect formation, a display of precision and power. The crowd gasped and cheered. As the noise faded, leaving a ringing in its wake, a brief, chaotic moment ensued. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the balcony, catching programs and threatening hats. Prince Louis, overwhelmed by the noise and the sudden commotion, began to fuss, reaching for his mother. Simultaneously, a loud, distinct boom from a protester's loudhailer echoed from the mall. Several on the balcony flinched, a ripple of unease moving through the dignified group. In that instant of minor turmoil, two things happened with remarkable synchronicity. Catherine, while soothing Louis, instinctively glanced across at George and Charlotte to ensure they were all right. Her eyes met Melania's, and Melania, in a move so subtle it was missed by almost every camera, gave a barely perceptible, slow blink, a silent signal of calm, of shared experience in managing unexpected storms in full view of the world. It was not a smile, not a word. It was a blink that said, "I see it. I know. We carry on." Catherine's responding glance, a quick softening around the eyes, was the acknowledgement. Then, as one, they turned back to the crowd, their postures perfect, their smiles back in place. The moment had lasted less than 3 seconds. The world saw a seamless recovery from a minor hiccup. They had shared a complete conversation in silence. The reception that followed was a whirl of champagne flutes, canapes, and dense thickets of conversation. The atmosphere was lighter now, the hardest public duties done. Melania found herself conversing with a group of British business leaders, discussing art investment. Catherine was across the room, talking to the American Secretary of State about a literacy initiative. Yet, throughout the room, a new, almost imperceptible dynamic was at play. At one point, as Melania extricated herself from a particularly lengthy conversation, she turned and found Catherine also breaking free from a circle nearby. Their paths converged near a magnificent floral display of white roses and ivy. "Escape achieved?" Catherine asked, her voice low and conspiratorial. A ghost of a true smile touched Melania's lips. Temporarily, they stood for a moment, appreciating the flowers, a neutral zone. "The roses are beautiful," Melania observed. "From the gardens at Amer Hall," Catherine replied. "They have a particular scent there, somehow wilder than the palace hothouse varieties." It was an offering of something personal, a piece of her private world. "I prefer gardens to hothouses," Melania said. The statement was simple, but layered. Catherine understood. The hothouse was the relentless, controlled, artificial environment of their public lives. The garden was something more authentic, if no less carefully tended. They were joined then by another guest, and the moment of private exchange ended. But the pattern continued throughout the evening. During the exchange of gifts in the white drawing room, when President Trump presented a first edition of a Winston Churchill book with characteristic flourish, Melania's eyes fleetingly found Catherine's. In Catherine's slight, polite nod as she received a gift for the children, there was a glimmer of shared bemusement at the theatricality of it all. Later, during the exchange of toasts at the banquet, as the president spoke in his expansive style and Prince Charles responded with dignified eloquence. The two women sat in their respective places of honor. They listened, their faces attentive masks. But when a particularly grandiose phrase from the president hung in the air, Catherine, taking a sip of water, allowed her gaze to drift just enough to catch Melania's. Melania, her hands folded on the tablecloth, gave the tiniest, almost invisible lift of her eyebrow. It wasn't a critique, it was an acknowledgement of the performance, a silent, "Here we go." Catherine had to quickly look down at her plate to suppress the faintest tremor of a smile. These were not signals of collusion or disrespect. They were the silent punctuation marks of two people who, having shared a genuine afternoon of understanding, now had a private channel in the crowded, noisy frequency of the state visit. They were navigating the same storm, and they had, without a word, agreed to be each other's silent barometer. The grand speeches, the clinking crystal, the watchful eyes of history, it all continued unabated. But within it, a quiet human thread had been spun, connecting two of the most visible women in the world in a pact of unspoken recognition. The banquet wore on, a spectacle of opulence and oration. But for them, the most meaningful communication had already happened in glances and blinks in the space between the words. The grandeur of the state banquet faded into the quiet hum of the palace at night. The last guests had departed, the journalists had filed their reports, and the towering rooms, emptied of their glittering crowds, seemed to sigh with relief. In her private suite, Melania stood by the window, looking out at the darkened gardens illuminated by soft, ghostly spotlights. The white dress was gone, replaced with comfortable loungewear. The performance for today was over. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant tick of a clock in the hallway. She replayed the day in her mind. Not the speeches or the handshakes, but the quiet moments. The bench in the alcove, the shared glance during the flypast, the unspoken understanding at the banquet. For years, her strategy had been one of impeccable detachment, a fortress built to withstand any siege. Today, for a few hours, she had lowered the drawbridge, not for a politician or a queen, but for another woman who lived in a similarly spectacular prison. It was a risk, but it hadn't felt dangerous. It had felt relieving. Across London, in a more familiar confines of Kensington Palace, Catherine was also in a state of quiet reflection. The children were long asleep, exhausted from their big day. She sat in her sitting room, a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her. The public narrative of the day was already being written, a study in contrasts, diplomatic success. But her mind kept returning to the private narrative, the one that would never make the news. She thought of Melania's wry comment about the shiny tool of pageantry, the weariness in her voice when she spoke of the constant performance, the genuine warmth when discussing Baron. This was not the woman portrayed in the media cartoons. This was someone who had mastered the art of survival in a uniquely brutal arena. Catherine felt a surge of respect and, something more, a sense of solidarity. Her own path had been chosen with love, guided by tradition and family. Melania seemed forged in a far more volatile fire. Yet, they had arrived at the same intersection of immense visibility and profound personal isolation. The next morning brought the final, more informal act of the visit, a farewell ceremony at Winfield House, the U.S. ambassador's residence. The mood was lighter, the stakes lower. There were still cameras, but the intense historical pressure of the palace had lifted. Melania and Catherine greeted each other with the polite warmth expected of them. But their handshake was firmer, their eye contact held a beat longer, a silent good morning between allies. During a walk through the residence's sun-dappled gardens, they found themselves paired together once more. The conversation was easier now, flowing without the same careful calibration. They spoke of more ordinary things, exercise routines that could be squeezed into insane schedules, the challenge of finding a quiet moment to read a book, the recipes that never failed to please picky children. Catherine recommended a children's author from New Zealand, Melania mentioned a Slovenian dessert her mother used to make. They were exchanging pieces of their true selves, the women behind the titles. As they rounded a bend in the garden path, secluded by a high hedge of yew, Catherine paused. "I meant to say," she began, her tone shifting to something more deliberate. "The work you're doing on online safety, I read your full platform paper. It's very comprehensive. The focus on emotional health, not just security settings, it's important." Melania stopped, genuinely surprised. Few people, even allies, ever reference the substance of Be Best. It was usually just a slogan in a news ticker. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It is a complex problem. The technology moves faster than the rules." "I know," Catherine nodded. "In my work on early childhood, we see the effects already. The anxiety in such young children. It starts so much earlier than people think." They stood there, two women whose platforms were often dismissed as soft or ceremonial, discussing the gritty, unglamorous details of policy and research. They spoke of algorithms and adolescent brain development, of parental controls that kids could bypass in minutes, of the struggle to get tech companies to engage. For 10 minutes, they were not a duchess and a first lady. They were two advocates comparing notes, strategizing in the dappled London sun, finding common cause in the digital wilderness that threatened the children of both nations. The moment was broken by the approach of aides, signaling it was time to prepare for the final departure. The spell of the garden was over. They walked back to the main house, their shoulders almost touching. At the porte cochere, where the armored cars waited, the official goodbye was a flurry of activity. President Trump and the ambassador were giving final statements to the press. In the controlled chaos, Melania and Catherine had one last moment away from the main microphones. They turned to each other. The formal words were said, "Thank you for your wonderful hospitality. It was an honor to have you." But then Catherine reached out, and instead of another handshake, she placed her hand on Melania's arm, leaning in to kiss her on the cheek, once on each side in the European style. It was a gesture of genuine warmth, far beyond protocol. "Take care of yourself," Catherine murmured, so only Melania could hear. Melania, momentarily taken aback, reciprocated the cheek kisses. Her usually impassive eyes were bright with something unreadable, gratitude, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of a connection that would now be relegated to memory. "And you," she replied. Their eyes locked one final time. No words were needed. The message was clear. "I see you. I understand. Good luck." Then Melania turned and descended the steps, disappearing into the dark interior of the limousine. Catherine stood on the steps, waving as the motorcade pulled away, a smile perfectly placed for the cameras. The cars became a distant blur, then vanished into the London traffic. The historic first meeting was over. The press would dissect their outfits, their expressions, their every interaction for days. Pundits would debate what it meant for transatlantic relations. But as Catherine turned to go back inside, the public smile faded into a pensive, private look. She felt a strange hollowness. The connection, so unexpected and so real, was now severed by distance and circumstance. They would likely never have such a conversation again. Their worlds were too different, their orbits too separate. But for one afternoon and morning, the isolation had been breached. They had built a small, invisible bridge across a chasm of politics and perception. In her car, Melania looked out at the passing streets, not seeing them. She felt the same peculiar mix of lightness and loss. She had met a woman who, against all odds, understood the specific gravity of her life. It was a gift, and like many gifts in her position, it was one she could never openly acknowledge or hold on to. Back in their respective palaces, one ancient, one metaphorical, the routines would resume. The schedules, the criticisms, the endless expectations. But something had changed, if only within them. They had been witnesses for each other. In a world where everyone had an opinion about them, they had found one person who simply saw them. Not the icon, not the symbol, but the person navigating the impossible job. The story of their unity was not one of political alliance or lasting friendship. It was a quieter, more human story, a fleeting moment of recognition between two souls living in the most gilded of cages, a reminder that even at the highest altitudes, where the air is thin and the view is vast, it is possible to feel profoundly seen. And sometimes that is enough.